if we trace back our history, then beyond the shadow of a doubt, there would be a heritage component reflecting our African heritage. The UNESCO, that's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization of St. Kitts and Nevis, established the Slave Root National Scientific Committee under the guidance of Dr. Ken Ballantyne and Mr. Antonio Maynard. The committee, through the foresight of a public lecture series subcommittee, saw the vision to provide lectures with the overall objective being reconciling the past to move into the future with confidence. And that, in my view, is a very important lesson for young people and the students here present this morning. The committee members who are here with us, the lecture series committee members, they expressed the view that it would be vital to include students who represent the future of our nations to participate and to benefit from these lectures.
As you've heard, the theme for the lecture is reconciling the past to move into the future with confidence. I want you to examine those words very carefully because each one is very important. You ask yourself a question, why reconciling the past? What reconciling is there to do? Has there been a falling out, so we need to make up and become reconciled? And I want to suggest that the choice of that word is very, very appropriate because in many respects, we are not on good terms with our history, with our past, and we need to become reconciled to it. We need to know our past, we need to understand our past, and above all, we need to have a very positive attitude towards our past. The sad thing, of course, is that if we're not positive about our past, then we can hardly expect somebody who doesn't belong here, who is not a citizen, who wasn't born here, to have a positive attitude to our past. Now, there are some people who feel that history is unimportant, it's irrelevant. And a famous inventor, Henry Ford, is reputed to have said that history is bunk. And I want you to dismiss that statement as bunk. Because history is extremely important in the life of an individual and in the life of a country. Extremely important. We have tended to reject our history principally for two reasons. Those who are able to express it and articulate it, they say, well, our history is all about slavery and colonialism. And they then go on to say, well, I can do without both of those things. I don't want to be any part of that. I don't want to be reminded of it. And I'm here to say to you this morning very, very confidently that we cannot dismiss our history. It simply won't go away. We have to come to grips with it and to recognize that even though in some instances it might cause us some pain, some shame, some anger, we need to come to grips with it and recognize that whatever our history might have been, it is part of us and we are part of it. Some people dismiss our history then because they say, well, slavery, it is such a terrible kind of experience, I don't want to be reminded of it. And at the same time, you have to remember that those persons who say that, at the same time condemn themselves as if to say, well, we have been slaves and therefore we are not worthy. And I hope that by the end of this lecture, you will be so motivated that you will reject that kind of a view. Because we were not born slaves. Some of our people were enslaved. That is to say, cruel, oppressive people, for reasons of greed and their own profit, enslaved our ancestors in order that they might become powerful and rich. And so dismiss the notion that we were born slaves and that in some way we are inferior and that in some way Africa is a backward place and Africa has not done anything by way of contributing to the civilization of this world. I want you to understand that there are many, many myths which you need to explode and throw out of the window. Because if you continue to believe those negative things about yourself and about your country, then you're not going to get very far. It is totally, totally incorrect to say, well, we, people of the Caribbean, were enslaved because we're inferior. But that is what some people want us to believe, even today. And you have to get rid of that notion because, you see, slavery exists in the world today, and it exists for the same reason, that there are selfish, greedy, oppressive people who will enslave even their own people, even their own children, in order to make money. And essentially, this is what was happening to Africans. They were living free. They were a civilized people. They had their own religion. They had their own forms of government. But there were greedy people among them as well, who fomented wars and who sold their own people into slavery in order that they might receive riches and power. And so it is not true to say that African people were born slaves. But bear in mind that slavery has always been part of the history of mankind. Slavery has always been that way. It is evidence of man's inhumanity to man. Those of you who are good Sunday school students, how many of you attend Sunday school? Just let me see your hands. Or attend church? Well, isn't that wonderful? Nearly everybody in this room attends Sunday school. All right? But you will recall that in the Old Testament is recorded the story of the Passover. And what was that about? That was not really about African people who were enslaved. These were Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt. And so, because of their faith in their God, because they believed that their God liberated them, because they believed the story of the Passover, you find that even today, thousands of years after, Jews celebrate the Passover. Now, if the Jews celebrate Passover, it is saying at least two things. That history is important to them. It is also saying that they will not be kept down. They will not be subordinated to the fact that they had, at a certain time in their history, been enslaved by others. And I think that this is a message which we have to get. We have to overcome the notion that, well, we feel shame, we feel pain, we feel anger. Bear in mind back here that some of the things which happened, you hear of whippings, people who were whipped until they came within just a of their own life. Because the society then was an extremely brutal and vicious kind of society, right? And sometimes you think of it and you have to dismiss the thought and not to keep in your heart any hatred, any desire to retaliate, any desire to seek vengeance on anybody else, and you have to have a spirit of forgiveness and to move on. But the point I'm making is that we have to forget the myths. Africa was not a land of infidels. Africa was not a land of barbarians. On the contrary, many of the writers who have been researching the early history, that is before slavery was introduced into the Caribbean, the early history of Africa, will tell you that Africa was really the birthplace of modern civilization. And I'll use one quotation, possibly two, just to make the point. A man named Chancellor Williams, who wrote a book called The Destruction of Black Civilization, says this, I quote, "The blacks were among the very earliest builders of a great civilization on this planet, including the development of writing, sciences, engineering, medicine, architecture, religion, and the fine arts." Students, this is not the figment of my imagination. The literature is there, and I'm appealing to you to delve into that history, the early history of Africa, and to recognize that we today are descended from a great people, from a people who had achieved great things. But such is the nature of life, such is the nature of civilization, that sometimes even the greatest civilizations can be destroyed. Indeed, other civilizations which follow the African civilization, they have been destroyed. So do not allow anyone to say to you, well, look at what is happening in Africa today. How can you say that Africa was the birthplace, was the cradle of civilization? The facts are there. Read them, and be inspired. Take pride in your heritage, and do not allow anyone to say to you that you are descended from people who are infidels and who are barbarians and who have not contributed anything to civilization. That quotation by Chancellor Williams was from a black man. A white man, Basil Davison, in his book, Africa in History, writes, I quote, "Greek civilization derived its religion, its philosophy, its mathematics, and much else from the ancient civilizations of Africa, and above all from Egypt of the pharaohs. To those founding fathers in classical Greece, any notion that Africans were inferior morally or intellectually would have seemed silly." End of quote. What I'm trying to say is that the people who have done the hard work, the research, who have delved into the early history of Africa, will tell you that these were great people running their country in model ways, and that in so many respects the Greeks and the Europeans and others who came after them learned all they could from the civilization of Africa. And so it is for us to learn our history, to take pride in it, allow it to inspire us and motivate us to great things, and not to allow any negative thoughts to inhabit our minds and our spirits. We need then to reconcile ourselves to our history. We need to accept it for what it is and to extract the positives. Because you see, even if you think of St. Kitts' history, you will have to recognize that St. Kitts has had many firsts, you know. And sometimes it annoys me even to hear people say today, well, St. Kitts people must have come from the most backward part of Africa. And I say, well, that if we appear today to be cowardly, if we appear today to be negative, it was not always so. The first slave revolt in the whole Caribbean took place in St. Kitts way back in 1639, I think it was. The point I'm making is that these were people who never submitted themselves to slavery. They had their pride. They had a strong sense of self. They had strong self-esteem. And the idea that they should live the rest of their lives in subordination to others was totally, totally unacceptable to them. Much has been written by Europeans about emancipation. And one cannot deny that for their own reasons in many cases, European philanthropists, European Christian leaders, they advocated the abolition of slavery. But never, never overlook the fact that our ancestors were there working every day. They were resisting in every conceivable way in order to try and win their freedom, because for them it was totally, totally unnatural and unacceptable that they should live in slavery. And so you have to bear in mind that our history is not a history where people just waited for somebody to come and liberate them. They were part of the process. They were working, they were resisting, and they were doing all sorts of things in order to ensure that they would gain their freedom. And so when freedom or emancipation came in 1834, officially, because in reality, the reality was something else. Officially, you had emancipation. A remarkable thing happened in St. Kitts, and we do not have evidence that it happened elsewhere. These people who were forced to be so docile, and who were kept under the whip, and who were being punished and oppressed, as if to a single individual, they all put down their tools and they went on strike. And many of them fled to the hills. And many of them said, well, leave the animals, let the animals take care of themselves. And they wanted to demonstrate that freedom was theirs, legally, naturally, and they were not going to be subordinated any longer. Because, as you may well recall from your history lesson, the arrangement was that you had a halfway house between full freedom and emancipation. And many of the slaves got wind and said, well, I want you to remember that the Queen, so they saw it, Queen Victoria, had given us our freedom, and it is the masters who wanted to deprive us of our freedom, and therefore we are going on strike. This is not the activity of a people who were ignorant, who were docile, who could not understand, and who didn't know instinctively and naturally what their rights were. These are people who had a sense of their own worth and their own dignity, and were prepared to do what was necessary in order to achieve that. And so this led almost naturally to St. Kitts being, in 1935, the place where